Hi, my name is Amy Peters, and I work with the Utah Personnel Development Center. I worked for a school district as a speech and language therapist and also a behavior specialist prior to joining the UPDC. So I know right off the bat, I want to say that it is so much harder to work with behavior with your own children than it is to work with other people's children, and I recognize that. I could tell a story. One time, my own son when he was much, much younger, he was having a full-blown tantrum, and my husband stood by and watched it unfold, but he didn't do anything to help me out. When it was over, and later that evening, I asked him, "Why don't you ever help me when that kind of thing is happening?" And he said, "Because no matter what I do, it will be wrong, so I choose to do absolutely nothing." I actually thought that was a really pretty good answer. But the truth is, when you're in the heat of battle, or at least you feel like you're in the heat of battle, it is never easy with your own children. And as a parent, we're on duty 24 hours a day. So, sadly, there are no super easy answers for making behavior go away. But what we can think about is why behavior is happening and then try to change the environment to make it less likely that our children will engage in challenging behavior. I think it can also be more difficult when we have young children who can't communicate their wants and needs, particularly if that child has an identified disability. I guess, having said that, it's also with older children who are typically developing who can tell you what their issues are, because that can be hard too. So we're going to start by watching a video clip and then talking about the behavior in it. Okay, I showed this clip as a great demonstration of how we can manipulate the environment. In the clip that you watch, the toddler follows who is likely the mom around the house, only tantruming when he is in his mother's presence. So then we start to ask, well, why is that happening? And what is the child getting out of that kind of behavior? So here's what we're going to cover today. We're going to define behavior, describe the functions of behavior, and discuss options for behavioral management. So what is behavior? Well, you all know what behavior is because you've seen it. We all hear about the terrible twos, for example, but actually behavior is everything a person does. In my training, they often referred to it as the dead man's test, which means if a dead man can do it, then it's not behavior. But basically everything else is. The second question is, why does behavior happen? When we ask this question, it leads us to consider the function or the reason behind the behavior, and we're going to talk more about that. Before we do, you could think back to the video clip that we watched, and why did the child only cry and drop to the floor in the presence of the mom? That becomes one of the questions we should consider. Okay, so the ABCs of behavior. Antecedent, in this example, well, on the screen, the antecedent is the fancy way of describing what happens before the behavior. Then you have the behavior itself, and then you have the consequence, which is what happens after the behavior. And that consequence makes it more or less likely that that same behavior will happen again in the future in a similar situation. So we're going to watch another clip.
Conjunction, junction, what's your function?
Hooking up words and phrases and clauses.
Conjunction, junction, how's that function?
I got 3 favorite cars that get most of my job done.
Conjunction, junction, what's their function?
I got and, but, and, or. They'll get you pretty far. And, that's an additive, like this and that. But, that's sort of the opposite. Not this, but that. And then there's or, O-R. When you have a choice like this or that. And, but, and, or get you pretty far.
Conjunction, junction, what's your function?
Hooking up 2 boxcars and making them run right. Milk and honey, bread and butter, peas and rice.
Hey, that's nice.
Dirty but happy, digging and scratching, losing your shoe and a button or 2. He's poor but honest, sad but true. Boo-hoo!
Conjunction, junction, what's your function?
Hooking up 2 cars to 1 when you say something like this. Choice, either now or later, or no choice. Neither now nor ever.
Hey, that's clever.
Eat this or that, grow thin or fat. Never mind, I wouldn't do that, I'm fat enough now.
Conjunction, junction, what's your function?
Hooking up phrases and clauses that balance like out of the frying pan and into the fire. He cut loose the sandbags, but the balloon wouldn't go any higher. Let's go up to the mountains or down to the seas. You should always say thank you or at least say please.
Conjunction, junction, what's your function?
Hooking up words and phrases and clauses in complex sentences like in the mornings when I'm usually wide awake, I love to take a walk through the gardens and down by the lake where I often see a duck and a drake. And I wonder as I walk by just what they'd say if they could speak. Although I know that's an absurd thought.
Conjunction, junction, what's your function?
Hooking up cars and making them function.
Conjunction, junction, how's that function?
I like tying up words and phrases and clauses.
Conjunction, junction, watch that function.
I'm gonna get you there if you're very careful.
Conjunction, junction, what's your function?
I'm going to get you there if you're very careful.
Conjunction, junction, what's your function?
I'm going to get you there if you're very careful.
Okay, I showed you that to introduce kind of the game we're going to play, but because this is a recorded webinar, you'll be doing it on your own. So sadly, I realized when I show that clip, I really date myself, and you now know I'm not 20 years old because I actually watched that cartoon as a child. When my son saw it, when I was embedding it into a presentation, he asked me if I was using it to show an example of old-fashioned cartoons. I didn't really think it was that funny. Okay, so moving on, here we go. Here's our first example. Matt is a 2-year-old boy. When I tell him that it's time for bed, he runs and hides. I go find him and try to comfort him because he usually gets upset. Eventually, I put him to bed. So we're going to do this as an I do example, meaning I'm going to give you the answers, and then the next ones I'll ask you to think through. So the antecedent in this example is that it's bedtime, which is a non-preferred activity, and it could be considered a transition time for this child, or for any child. Then you have the behavior, which is hiding and crying. Then you have the consequence, which is comfort, such as hugging and holding him, which could also be labeled as attention, because we're giving the child attention after the behavior happened. Okay, now we're going to look at the next one. So May is 3 years old. Sometimes when we are shopping, she drops to the floor and refuses to get up. I usually have to pick her up and do my best to calm her down by talking to her. So I want you to start to kind of think through this, and as I explain the answers, I'll kind of pause to give you a chance to decide for yourself what you think the answers are. So what do you think the antecedent in that example is. Take a minute and think about that. Okay, in that example, the antecedent is walking around the store, shopping, if you will. So now think about what the behavior is. So the behavior is dropping to the floor. See if you can identify the consequence. The consequence is holding and talking to her, which again could be labeled attention. So let's do one more. Max is a 2-year-old boy. He often cries in the grocery store when we have been there more than 20 minutes or so. I take him to the bakery for a free cookie and he generally calms down. Let's look at our little diagram again. So what is the antecedent in that example? So it's shopping or walking around the store. What is the behavior in that example? It's crying. And what is the consequence in that example? It's attention in the form of getting something tangible, which in this particular case is food. And tangible is just another word for an object or item, and in this case, again, it's food. Okay, so here's another example. Sally is 18 months old. She continues to have a hard time sleeping through the night. This is probably something many of us have experienced. She will wake up and call out for my husband and I. We slowly wake up and discuss what we should do. We ignore her. Eventually, one of us will go and get her and stay with her in her room until she is settled again. Okay, so let's think through that same scenario, looking at antecedent, behavior, consequence. So what do you think the antecedent is? The antecedent to the behavior is waking up in the night. What is the behavior? Calling for the parent. And then think about what you think the consequence could be. This one's a little tricky. So you might think that the consequence was ignoring, but remember, they eventually went and got her. So actually, it's probably attention. This brings up a really important point. Sometimes we think we are ignoring something when really we attend to it after it's gone on for a while, or at least sometimes we attend to it and sometimes we ignore it. So our child could be engaging in a behavior and we think, well, I ignore it, but then there are those times where you don't ignore it. And so you might be, the consequence for some behaviors might be more of a mixed bag. Here's an example I could give you of a similar situation. One time I was working in a classroom and we had a student that would cry and tantrum, and we really believed she was doing it for attention. And so we were told to ignore her by the specialist that was coming in to work with us. So when she started to tantrum, our body language would change and our facial expression would change, and we'd fold our arms and be really stern looking, I think. But the doctoral student who was training us told us that what we needed to do was start to engage in conversation with another person anytime the child started to tantrum. When we did that, the behavior of the child actually got worse the first time because she was no longer getting us to fold our arms and turn away and stiffen our body posture and generally look stressed out. So our reaction to her behavior, even though we weren't saying anything to her, was enough in this instance to keep challenging behavior going. And after it became clear to the student, by us talking to other staff and just going on about our business instead of standing close by her and making those faces and things, then she eventually learned that crying and dropping and tantruming wasn't going to get any kind of reaction from us anymore. So sometimes even when we think that we're ignoring or that we're doing things like that, it might be that still our behavior changes in a way that it signals to the child that we're still giving some attention. So, having said that, we've used a lot of examples about attention, but there are absolutely times when it's appropriate to attend to a behavior and not ignore it. Now we're going to move on and talk a little bit about function of behavior. Here are the three basic reasons why behavior happens. So we have attention, escape or avoid, and sensory. I've already mentioned them in some of the examples, but I think I can explain them a little bit more. And the reason this is so important is because we can never ever change our child. The only thing we can manipulate or change is the environment, or what we do or say or how we behave when behavior happens. And that's true of behavior that we want to have, like good behavior, if you will, and also behavior that we do not want to see happen, like challenging behavior. And I do think it's important to make the point that with dangerous or severe challenging behaviors, parents really probably do need some help and support to figure out how to respond to those. But with mild behavior that doesn't really pose a threat to the safety of you or your child, it's okay to try changing the response that you generally give to a challenging behavior and see what happens. Having said that, it's not going to be successful or sufficient if you only do it once or twice. So it's really important to decide what behavior and circumstance specifically that you are going to focus on and be consistent in how you respond to that behavior for at least a couple of weeks. So it isn't good enough to just do it once or twice. All right, I didn't really explain those, so let me go back and do that right now. Attention is when the child is getting some attention or something for the behavior that they're engaging in. So we already mentioned some examples where they were getting like a cookie. So that's getting something tangible. It could be access to a toy or a preferred activity, or just getting the parent to react to what it is they're doing. And when I say react, and I'm talking about attention, it could be attention that is kind attention, if you will, or it could even be things like being scolded, because it's still attention that you're giving to the child. Escape or avoid is when the child is doing some behavior to get out of or avoid doing something at all. And sometimes they can misbehave, children can misbehave, even to escape something temporarily. So even if you're really good about following through and making them do something that they don't want to do, sometimes just getting out of it for a little while is good enough. So even in my own behavior, I have some escape kinds of things in that maybe there are chores at my house that I don't want to do, and I'll sit down and read a book or watch a TV show. Even though I know I'm still going to have to do them, I'll do other things, engage in other things to escape or avoid it even temporarily. And sometimes our kids will engage in challenging behavior even if the non-preferred thing they're going to be asked to do is still waiting for them. They can misbehave just to have it delayed temporarily. And the last one is those sensory kinds of things. Those are things that are maintained by things that are internally reinforcing. So no one is doing anything to give you any attention or to allow you to escape a task. It's all internally reinforcing. For adults, I think a good example is listening to music. No one gives you attention for that or says, nice listening to music, or I like how you're listening to music. Whatever it is that you enjoy about that is internally reinforcing. For me, the example that I often use is I sometimes play with my hair. And I don't know what it is about playing with my hair that I actually like, but at times when I don't have things going on, or I'm thinking about things, or I'm just not focused on what it is I'm doing, I'll find that I'm playing with my hair and I don't even notice that I'm doing it. For children with autism, you might see that they flap their hands or walk on their toes, or when they look at lights or other things in funny ways kind of out of the corners of their eyes. That's called ocular stimulation. Those things too are also considered sensory stimulation, in that they're reinforcing themselves in some way for whatever it is they're getting out of it. Okay, the next slide is about reinforcement. And reinforcement is defined as any consequence that makes it more likely that the behavior will happen again in the future. If you simply punish a behavior or do something that makes it less likely that that behavior will happen again in the future, you don't know what need your child is having met by the challenging behavior that they were engaging in. So here's another story. I recently was told about a mom that had a 3-year-old girl and a 6-month-old baby. Every time the mom was getting ready to leave the house, the 3-year-old would start to tantrum and tell her mom that she was scared to leave. The 3-year-old in the past had been a really social child, and the mom didn't know what was happening or why the child was developing, as she described it, so much anxiety. The mom had also tried a variety of things. She tried warning her daughter before they were going to go somewhere, and that only seemed to make the tantruming start earlier. She tried comforting her and talking to her about it, but over time that didn't really seem to be making it better either. So the mom was stumped because the daughter would do it even when they were headed somewhere that she knew that her child enjoyed, like the grandparents' house, the child's grandparents' house. So when we started problem solving the situation, it seemed that the consequence the daughter was getting for her challenging behavior was mom's attention. And having said that, with a new baby in the house, she wasn't getting the same level of attention that she used to get from her mom. So what we decided to try was to give her daughter the attention she wanted, but at a different time. So when the mom was getting ready to leave the house, she would bring the 3-year-old into the bathroom with her and set her up on the counter, and they would have some, as they described it, mommy and me time while the mom got ready to go out by doing her hair and makeup and stuff like that. Okay, so that's kind of an example of reinforcement. What usually happens when challenging behavior occurs? Remember that you're trying to think through those ABCs, the antecedent, the behavior, and the consequence, to get what to the function of the behavior might really be. What usually happens when challenging behavior does not occur? This is probably one of the really most important considerations for you, and if you take nothing else out of this short webinar, really think through what you do with your own children in this situation. So what I mean is, it's really easy to just move on with life and be grateful that a challenging behavior that typically happens at a certain time didn't happen. But we also have to catch our kids being good. So if your child sometimes struggles with tantruming in the store, but one time you go and he doesn't, then that's the time you want to say, "Wow, you were awesome in the store today." Give him a hug and take him to the bakery to get that, in our local store, free cookie. Because it's so important to catch our kids being good instead of just ignoring those times when they hit it on the mark and paying attention to the times that they misbehave. So it's just as important, if not more so, to attend to the behavior that we want to see, not just to the behavior that we don't want to see. So now we'll just review a couple of the key strategies for success. You want to be proactive instead of reactive. Think through a plan for what you're going to do when challenging behavior occurs, and then be consistent in how you apply that plan. You want to respond as neutrally as possible to all challenging behavior. Remember that the only thing we can change is the environment, not the child. So it really doesn't do anybody, including ourselves, any good to take it personally or react with strong emotion. We want to remain consistent, and I've mentioned that a few times. And I think that we all probably know that in our heart of hearts, but sometimes it's just hard to remember it when you're in the moment. But once you decide on a plan, stick with it for at least 2 weeks. That's a general rule of thumb. Then we want to reinforce behavior that we want to see. That's the most recent thing we just talked about. So you want to tell your child or reward them when you catch them doing things correctly. One other thing we didn't talk about, but it's also important, is to specifically teach your child the behavior that you want to see them engage in. So if it's following directions, you could practice with your child at times that are not critical instead of a time that you absolutely have to have them get their shoes on to go somewhere. So when I say go get your shoes, you say, okay, and then you do it, so that you are actually modeling what that routine looks like for your child and practicing it in non-real time. Okay, I think lastly, I will leave you with a cartoon clip that tickles my funny bone. The first frame says, I thrive on change. You? You threw a fit this morning because your mom put less jelly on your toast than yesterday. I thrive on making other people change. And I think sometimes that's really true, that our kids can get the best of us in that we change our behavior in order to keep the peace. And what we have to remember is that changing behavior is really a process, and we have to take it one step at a time and stick with those plans that we put into place. Okay, thank you very much.